The town of Red Hollow lay under the weight of a late summer sun, the heat pressing down like an anvil upon every shingle, every boardwalk, every rattling window shutter that framed the tired little settlement, and in its dusty heart stood the gallows, raw pine timbers hammered together by rough hands, still smelling of sap and sweat, and before it a crowd of townsfolk had gathered, not out of any thirst for justice but for the spectacle of a hanging, for nothing brought folks from miles around. Quicker than the promise of death played out under the sky, and today their curiosity was piqued all the more because the one condemned was not a cattle thief nor a gunman nor even some scoundrel outlaw but a young woman, a slip of a girl with tangled auburn hair and the fire of desperation in her eyes, her dress torn at the sleeve, her wrists bound cruelly in front of her, the rope already fitted loosely around her slender throat as the sheriff stood smugly nearby, the sun glinting off the brass of his star, his hat tilted low to hide the satisfaction written across his face, and though he told the people she was guilty of theft and lying, the truth that none of them would hear was that her only crime had been knowledge, for she had overheard something she was never meant to hear, something that reached into the rotten core of the power in Red Hollow, a secret so venomous that it could poison every man who had built his fortune off the sweat and blood of others, and in their fear of her words they had turned to the oldest solution the frontier knew. Silence threw the hangman's rope, and so she stood there trembling on the platform while mothers covered their children's eyes and men whispered wagers about how long it would take her neck to snap, and above them the sky burned mercilessly, as if heaven itself had no pity left to give, and all the while her mind reeled with the memory of how she had come to this awful brink. Of the night she had stumbled upon the sheriff and two strangers in the back of the saloon, their voices low but sharp as knives, speaking of a federal man who had arrived in town under the guise of a surveyor but was in truth hunting evidence of their smuggling operation, the secret flow of rifles and whiskey across the border to the Apaches, traded for silver and stolen horses, and she had crouched in the shadows listening, her breath caught in her chest as they spoke openly of killing the agent, burying his body in the gulch, and blaming it on drifters, and she, terrified but unwilling to let such wickedness go unchallenged, had tried to tell the marshal in the next county, but the sheriff was quicker, his men dragging her back before she had crossed the ridge, branding her a liar and a thief who had stolen from the town safe, fabricating papers to prove her guilt, and now here she was, a rope scratchy against her skin, her voice hoarse from crying her innocence to ears that did not wish to hear, and as the hangman placed his hand upon the lever she closed her eyes, wondering if death would at least be swift, when suddenly the sound of hooves thundered up the main street, a single rider cutting through the dust like a storm, and the crowd turned as one to see a tall figure astride a black stallion, his duster flapping, his rifle already leveled in his hand, his voice carrying like a cannon shot as he commanded the hangman to stand down, and every head in Red Hollow knew him in an instant though few dared to speak his name aloud. The rancher, a man whose spread lay beyond the hills, who had fought in wars before he ever laid claim to land, a man both respected and feared, for he was known to fight not for money nor favor but for justice, a relic of honor in a land that had grown fat on corruption, and as he reined in before the gallows, dust boiling around his horse's hooves, his eyes locked with the girl's, and in them she saw not pity but purpose, as though he had come not merely to rescue her but to wage war upon the evil that had ensnared her, and in that breathless instant the world held still, the crowd unsure whether to cheer or flee, the sheriff's hand twitching toward his gun, and the girl, feeling the noose shift with her heartbeat, realized that perhaps death had not claimed her yet. The sheriff barked an order, his voice cracking with anger at being challenged in front of the entire town, his deputies raising rifles to aim at the lone rider, but the rancher did not flinch, his gaze steady, his finger resting on the trigger in such a way that every man present knew he could put a bullet through an eye at 50 yards before their clumsy hands even finished cocking a hammer, and for a moment the standoff froze, the weight of history pressing down upon them, until the rancher's voice rang out again, low and steady, saying that if the hangman pulled that lever he'd be the first man to fall, and the hangman, sweating, trembling, looked from the sheriff to the stranger on horseback and back again, his courage failing him, for though he had been paid in silver to see this job through, he had no wish to die for it, and his hand fell from the lever. A murmur rippled through the crowd, half of them cursing, half of them silently relieved, and in that confusion the rancher spurred his horse forward, leaping from the saddle with a grace that belied his size, cutting through the distance with long strides, his knife flashing as it sliced through the girl's bonds, the rope falling uselessly from her throat, and for the first time in days she drew a breath unchoked, gasping, her chest heaving with life, and the rancher caught her by the arm, steadying her even as the sheriff roared for his men to fire, but the rancher's Colt was already in his hand, and the first shot split the sheriff's hat wide, sending it spinning, the second shattered the rifle of a deputy who had raised it too slow, and the third kicked up dust at the boots of the crowd, scattering them back in fear, and in that pandemonium he lifted her into his saddle, swung up behind, and drove his spurs into the black stallion's flanks, the horse surging forward with the power of a locomotive, scattering men, barrels, and wagons alike as they tore down the main street, bullets whining after them, windows shattering, women screaming, men shouting, but the rancher leaned low, his arm around the girl, his body a shield against the lead that hissed through the air, and in that desperate flight she buried her face against his coat, the smell of leather and sweat and gunpowder filling her senses, and she thought perhaps she was still dreaming, that rescue at the very lip of death could not be real, yet the pounding of hooves and the roar of gunfire were too sharp, too brutal to belong to dreams, and so she clung to him, feeling the steady rhythm of his heart as though it were an anchor in a world gone mad, and together they burst free of the town's edge, the open plain spreading before them like salvation, though the echoes of pursuit were already rising, for the sheriff's pride would not allow the insult to go unanswered, and men were mounting, spurring after them with curses on their lips and greed in their hearts, for the girl was now more than a condemned prisoner, she was a secret liability, a mouth that could spill the truth and topple the powers of Red Hollow, and the rancher, grim-eyed against the wind, knew it too, his jaw set like iron as he bent low over the reins, pushing the stallion harder across the sun-baked earth, the sagebrush whipping past, the horizon shimmering with heat, until at last the gunfire dwindled, the town shrinking behind them, though the danger had not passed, only deepened, for they had not escaped into freedom but into a wider battlefield, one where the rancher would have to pit his wits, his steel, and his will against the dark forces that ruled the frontier. She clutched the saddle horn, her voice breaking as she whispered thanks that came out half sob, half prayer, and he only shook his head, saying nothing, for in his mind words mattered less than distance, and distance mattered less than survival, and only once they had climbed into the shelter of the hills did he slow the stallion, reining in under the shadow of a cottonwood where a thin stream trickled, the horse blowing hard, its flanks lathered, and only then did he let her slide gently to the ground, her legs buckling beneath her from exhaustion and fear, and he crouched beside her, his gaze sharp yet not unkind, asking her name, asking what devil's business had brought a girl to the gallows of Red Hollow, and she swallowed hard, her throat raw, her lips cracked, but she told him, haltingly, every word tumbling out with the urgency of a heart that had carried its burden too long. The sheriff's plot, the smuggling, the murder, the frame-up, and how she had thought if only she could reach the next county she might find someone who still believed in law more than profit, but instead she had been dragged back, beaten, mocked, thrown in a cell until the day of hanging, and now she had no one, nothing, not even a family name left to her, for her kin had died in the fever years back, leaving her to scrape a living as a seamstress and server until fate set her ear against that saloon door, and as her voice cracked under the weight of all she had endured, the rancher listened, his face darkening with each word, until at last he stood, his fists clenched at his sides, and he said in a voice that rumbled like distant thunder that she was not alone now, and that if Red Hollow thought it could bury its sins under the prairie, it had reckoned wrong, because the West was still wide enough for justice, if a man was willing to pay the price, and though she shivered at the promise of more violence, more danger,